Okay. Well, hi everybody. We'll continue to admit people as they come through, but I might just introduce myself and introduce the panel here today so that we can get started. Um, so hello, welcome to the very first Laser Bergen presentation in an ongoing series of talks, lectures, and presentations of creative works that we're going to have that are in and around the themes of more than human and post-human narratives, digital creative practices, techno arts and AI, and many other interesting and probably at times concerning things. Laser Bergen is part of the Leonardo Laser Network, founded by Leonardo, the International Society for the Arts, Sciences, and Technology. And Laser Bergen is hosted by the Center for Digital Narrative, a Norwegian Center of Research Excellence at the University of Bergen, who explores how narratives and creative practices shaped by computation are transforming culture. My name is Alinta, and I'm going to be your host today. It's actually not Christmas, despite what you're seeing on my clothing. It's just a sweater. So we have a very exciting lineup for you today. We have three enigmatic speakers. We have Jordan Magnuson, we have Julian Stadon, and we have Jason Nelson, who will each speak on the topic of more than human narratives within their distinct practices. And then we're going to have playtime. This is an improvised session where the three speakers are going to muse together on how a team might go about designing an artistic outcome based loosely around this theme of non-human narratives, but I can't say anything specific yet because it's going to be quite improvisational. And hopefully, you're going to see how ideas are born in the moment from interdisciplinary collaborations and interactions between people, such as our three speakers today. So please do be prepared for today's session to go a little bit over time. So if you have to duck out, that's okay. We will, of course, also have a question time as well before that overtime. And so if you have any questions, please type them into the chat as we go along. I'll collect them and read them out come question time. That way we can keep our microphones off during the presentations themselves. So, just to briefly introduce each speaker before we begin, we have Jordan Magnuson, who's a game designer and media artist whose work explores how video games can express experience in poetic and culturally resonant ways. For over 15 years now, he's created award-winning independent games and game poems, and is the author of the book Game Poems, Video Game Design as Lyric Practice. Jordan is currently based at the University of Southampton in the UK. We also have Julian Stadon, who is an Australian artist, designer, curator, researcher, and educator. He comes from a background in marine biology and then moved into electronic art. So I'm super keen to hear more about that science-art connection. His practice-based research interfaces art, biodigital entanglements, embodied interactivity, food ecologies, culture, and society. He's the founder of DorkBot in Perth and many other organizations, and is currently also based at the University of Southampton in the Winchester School of Art. Then finally, we will have Jason Nelson, who's a professor of digital culture here at the University of Bergen and a principal investigator in the Center for Digital Narrative. He's also an award-winning and renowned creator of quirky digital poems and fictions, a builder of art games and all kinds of digital art expressions. He was the first digital literature creator to sit on the Australia Council Literature Board, and his works have won prestigious awards such as a Webby Award, as well as many others. So without further ado, because I know we have so much to pack in today, I'd like to hand it straight over to the three speakers to take you through some of their interesting creative works. And we're going to start with Jordan Magnuson. Jordan, how are you?
Very good. Thank you very much, Alinta. Very happy to be here. Yeah, thanks so much for organizing this. Looking forward to it. So yeah, I'll go ahead and just share my screen. Yeah, should I go ahead and share my screen to start out here?
Please.
Okay. Let's see. So there we go. Game poems and more than human perspectives. Is that coming through okay? Great. So yeah, so going to talk a little bit briefly here to introduce my topic on game poems and more than human perspectives. What's this all about? Well, I'm a maker with a broad interest in digital art and new media and electronic literature, right? But I'm particularly interested in, as Alenta mentioned, video games. My background is actually in the indie games community, and I generally consider video games to be the primary medium that I work with. Video games. So I show this image because we're here, of course, to talk about interventions in the creation of non-human narratives, right? And video games have historically been very focused not just on human narratives, right, but on very particular sorts of human narratives, right? The natural world is often present in video games, right? But we often see that world from the perspective of someone looking down the barrel of a gun, or the perspective of someone clearing nature away for extractive purposes. You can see there used to be trees here once down in the corner there, or the perspective of someone farming animals as fungible tokens. Right now, obviously, these sorts of images, right, don't represent all video games, but they do reflect significant threads that go back to sort of the main trajectories of video games as a mass medium over time, right? A medium that's always been deeply entangled with things like industrialism and capitalism and militarism. Right. So the question I've been asking for many years is, how can creators challenge and push out video games as a medium within popular culture? How do we begin to imagine and facilitate new types of games from what we've made in the past? Right. And one lens that I've found helpful in this process is the lens of poetry. What happens when games, when we make games as a form of poetic expression, games that are intimate and tightly constrained. All right, and I've written a book about this approach titled Game Poems, Video Game Design as Lyric Practice, which is open access. You can download the ebook for free if you like from gamepoemsbook.com. And the book is about using lyric poetry as a sort of creative methodology for making new sorts of video games, right? Tiny games that rely on symbol and metaphor, or that use maybe classic video game aesthetics, but that ask the player to maybe slow down and reflect rather than speeding up. So to get back to the topic at hand today, right, how can poetry help us begin to incorporate other ways of seeing in video games, particularly when it comes to nature and more than human narratives and perspectives? Well, as we already noted, right, mainstream video games have often framed the world as an object and a resource, right? Something to be used, to be consumed, to be destroyed, and that's where you get, images like this, and like this, and like this. And poetry, by contrast, right, has a long tradition of casting the world itself as subject, right, as alive, as organic, as full of interconnected living beings. Ursula K. Le Guin has this great quote at the start of one of her poetry collections. She says, "One way to stop seeing trees or rivers or hills only as natural resources is to class them as fellow beings, kinfolk. Poetry is the human language that can try to say what a tree or a rock or a river is, that is, to speak humanly for it in both senses of the word for." And we don't have time, obviously, right at this moment to take a deep dive into poetry. But one way that poetry can help us, I think, notice different perspectives is through poetic address, this concept of poetic address or triangulated address, right? In a poem, the question of who is speaking and whom they are speaking to is often uncertain, and it often shifts or changes as you read. So what can this look like in a game? Let me give you a couple of quick examples of sort of what I'm talking about. So this is a screenshot from one of my games titled When Gold is in the Mountain. This is a game that is a sort of digging simulator about the quest for gold. The perspective here is that of the gold digger. It's the human perspective. And in fact, the gold digger initially seems to be the only subject that's present in this game. right? But as you dig further and further into the mountain starts to speak back to you in sounds and groanings. And eventually, in the end, the game shifts to the perspective of the mountain itself, as it were, which unleashes a flood to wash away the player and all the gold. And so it's the mountain sort of that has the final word actually in the game. So the game, like several of my games, ends up being about this interplay of the human and more than human perspectives. Or here's another game that I'm working on currently. Actually, this one plays with the same tension again between human and non-human perspectives and sort of ambiguous identity. In this one, you have a player character that's made up of just 3 pixels on the screen. You can kind of see over to the right there. And the assumption is probably that this represents a human because that's what most avatars typically represent in video games, however simple they are, right? And in this game, you fall off a cliff and you fall past the sort of wreckage and decay of human civilization. And there are words from poems, from a poem rather, falling with you from Rilke's Book of Hours. And eventually you fall into darkness and you emerge at the end of this as what seems to be a bird, perhaps, right, which connects back to the Rilke poem. But the game is sort of asking this question of whose perspective is this, right? Maybe in some sense the game is about our need to learn from nature. I think that's part of what the Rilke poem is getting at. But maybe in some sense it's also about moving beyond human perspectives altogether, right? Maybe we as humans are sort of in the wreckage here, and nature will continue to evolve and transform long after we are gone. And I'll give one more quick example from my practice, which is this game with Magnus to Norway. And on the one hand, this game is clearly telling a human story. But my hope is that as the player walks and walks and walks in this game, you do a lot of walking, they gradually realize again the kind of poetic address that's at play here and how it's used to invoke a voice beside the human. Because everything that you see in this journey, or all that you see really, is nature depicted in different ways, right? The game is sort of asking you to imagine nature speaking back to you as you walk, right? What if you stripped all the human stuff away? What might you hear? What might you notice? So again, this idea from the Ursula K. Le Guin from Ursula K. Le Guin of using poetic address and poetic framing to try to speak humanly for something that's not human. And beyond my own game making, I've been giving workshops on making game poems over the last couple of years, often using the Le Guin quote as a kind of prod. This is a workshop game from the perspective of a raindrop finding its way home to the ocean. This is one about a human body seen from the perspective of larva. And this is one about the life of an urban tree. So these games are miles away from this image here, right? So to conclude, I think my 10 minutes are just about up here, but I think the poetry framing and the use of poetic devices like ambiguity, metaphor, shifting address offer sort of an interesting toolbox for exploring more than human perspectives in games, right? And I think if enough creators, I show the workshop stuff because I think if enough creators start making these kinds of small poetic games, right, that kind of accessible entryway is important to me. I think that slowly, again, that pushes back against the very human-centered traditions that have been dominant in shaping video games so far over their history. So yeah, that's my bit. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Jordan. If you have any questions for Jordan, please leave them in the chat. But in the meantime, we'll move on to Julian Stadon. Julian, hello.
Hi there, everyone. Okay, I'll just share my screen now. Yeah, so thanks for having me, obviously, and it's nice to do a Leonardo laser talk. So essentially, I'm looking at this topic in terms of what I kind of have titled "Augmenting More Than Human Ecologies." So I guess most of the narratives I'm going to describe here evolve from my personal experiences, usually quite serendipitous experiences, and my emergent kind of subjective relationships and collaborative co-created kind of works that I build from these relationships. So essentially, I look at all these works as kind of augmentations of these different things in order to tell the stories of these non-human, what I'm going to call friendships, because they're all amicable, right? So, um, yeah, I'm just going to kind of start with my transition from more digital clones to microbial ecologies. Um, I've kept this really practice-based, so it's looking at projects essentially. Going to try to zip through them, talk a little bit about methods if we have time, and then just a bit of future direction. So, yeah, so an early work I did, Waste War. This is kind of a first work I made with this, where I took all the waste food from my university cafe. They'd for some reason put it in these plastic containers and then throw it in the bin. I found out later it was a health and safety thing, but I collected all of these and made a 7 by 2 meter wall of this waste. And it was kind of funny because it was biohazardous. Someone got kicked out of uni for it. But the idea was that through this fermenting and kind of decomposition of food, we that's kind of a method of engaging with unseen collaborators, also looking at nourishment decay and metabolic ecologies. Okay, so moving on, kind of a big leap from early bachelor work to my PhD project. This was looking at digital clones and data body trading. So um, I won't dive into this, but these were non-human collaborations with avatars and looking at post-biological identity and embodiment. This was kind of interestingly collaborating with my own organs through CT scanning. This is quite funny because I made an AR experience in a VR simulation of the experience. But so what you were doing was you were scanning, cloning organs and selling them um, as a kind of speculative work looking at ownership of individual data. This then evolved into collaborations with organisms, working with monocyte cells to farm organs, for example, at Upmeet's Radical Openness. And then we're looking at this kind of performances of monetizing monocytes. So essentially building flesh from artists that then we sell, rather facetiously. But this also correlates with this work I did working again collaboratively with protozoid amoeba from the Swan River, where essentially I took those amoeba and I put them into the second life environment. So here you can see the cells. I took the XY position, the XY velocity, and made this audio that you're hearing combined with the movements of them in a virtual. So again, this is looking at scale. It's looking at kind of microbe to macro ecologies and kind of augmenting them into a human sensory context. Um, I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of projects I did with my teleagriculture platform, which is a distributed platform for merging environmental sensors with cultural cultivation. Rhizomatic bias is kind of the main project I want to talk about because essentially here I built 3 aquaponic biospheres, one in Rotterdam and 2 in Linz for different festivals. And using sensors and chatbots, I developed a cyberbullying network where learning models of different data and different evolutions of data in the systems would essentially rank you in terms of which was the most normal system. The 2 most normal systems would cyberbully the least normal system, and there would be real world consequences through volume of the speaker that played directly in the fish tank and the spectrums of light used to essentially cyberbully a system to death. And this was looking at biases in agri-tech management systems, particularly around this time, the Monsanto system. So this is the chatbot database. I built a semantic data set of emojis to tell you what the different values were in terms of the environmental data. This then was translated into the bullying network, which looked like this. So moving on a little bit from that, because I know my time is constrained, the project that followed on from that is called MySmarts, Speaking from the Grid Together, where you would actually speak to a field of corn, and there would be microphones recording you along with the sensory sensors, and it would output these kind of responses, what we kind of tongue-in-cheek called kernels of information, where it would directly, using speech to text, speak back to you. You'll see the emoji data set in there again. And yeah, so that's kind of one way of quite passively back and forth responding. And then this is more of a collaboration. The Feel Your Fermented Biome project residency I did with Roland van Dierenonk at Coalesce in Buffalo, where basically Roland and I were the self-experiment sample, where over a period of about 6 weeks, we would try different microbe-loaded foods in different weeks. So we did acetobacillus 1 week, lactobacillus another week, etc. We would then do 16S gene line sequencing to test our microbes and the effect of these fermented foods on microbial identity and empathy and identity within humans collaborating with these internal beings. From that, a lot of different works evolved more experientially from what happened. This is a work, same shit, different story, where I essentially mapped our genomic sequence bacteria populations to these two spheres. The first sphere was the kind of base sample, and then you can see here it's oscillating and quite violently moving according to the effects that these different fermented foods had on a microbiome. Roland is the one on the right because he has a much more plain diet than me, so he really responded poorly to these crazy fermented foods that we had. The impossibility of working in this context then evolved into this project, Fecal Alchemy, where I kind of quite humorously turned my shit into gold by mapping my oral microbiome to my fecal microbiome and a soil microbiome. And essentially when the microbes would match, so when you'd have an oral bacteria that matches a fecal bacteria and a soil bacteria, it would effectively turn this 3D GAN generated model of my shit into gold. And the audio you're hearing is actually evolving when those different genera of bacteria would meet each other and essentially clash and transition from shit into gold. So this is kind of looking at somewhat the impossibility with collaborating with non-humans. And of course, these build different narratives. So moving on quickly from this, because I want to get through these slides, this is looking collaboratively to make things that kind of essentially were supposed to make money, but were more about storytelling and essentially greenwashing. So this is a project with Gucci Future Artisans, where I was looking at cymatics with bacteria and different dyes to essentially create scarves for Gucci based on the patterns that the bacteria and the dyes make from cymatic interventions. This was another project I did called Greenwashing. Now it's called Greenwashing Stella McCartney, where we were commissioned to make a photosynthetic t-shirt. So very much collaborating with cyanobacteria to produce oxygen and consume carbon. This again was a very long project that became a kind of, it was a speculative project that evolved into this kind of ad for the company rather than a product. So it was kind of interesting and not usually the project I kind of do. So again, working across scales of animal to microbe, this is a project called Grundelreis, which is travels of this goby species, looking at kind of building a storytelling for an invasive species of goby that doesn't really, it's not valued at all. And so this was different interventions. We were fishing them, we were eating them. This is a project where we made garum, an ancient Roman fermented flavoring, a bit the same as Worcester sauce. We also made a zine, Untergrundel, which was kind of teaching you how to fish these pest species because you don't get fined, you don't need a license to fish them. As you can see on the far right slide, learning how to make burgers out of this food. We did slow TV with it, where we streamed it to YouTube in case you got bored during COVID. Yeah, and then moving on to one of my, I should finish soon, one of my last projects, Forced Culturing, Transatlantic Narratology. This was looking at colonialization from Europe to North America and other colonies around the world, and how we try to enforce our culture on these spaces. So essentially, I took an Austrian freshwater pearl mussel. I took some of the mother of pearl of that, and we actually force injected it, as you do for culturing unnatural oysters, into an invasive species of zebra mussel, which is inundating the Erie Canal system and the Erie, like Lake Erie. And so, this was asking all kinds of different questions, such as what colonial migration means, what's the difference between migration and invasion, um, how do we place value on different species of non-human things, and then how do we collaborate with them? So a couple more projects. Sorry, you can cut me off if I'm going over. Swan Tweety was a project where I took this leisure craft, this inflatable toy swan, to make a direct intervention as a response to all the boats that come out in Linz along the Danube in spring, which is the time when all the swans are nesting and little cygnets are hatching, and the wake from the boats drown the swans. So I built this little swan with an accelerometer. So when the boats would create too much waves, it would spam tweet all the environmental and government agencies in Linz with information about all the wrongdoing they're doing that damages the Danube, essentially. Yeah, and just to really quickly finish on the methods that I use of this, which is something that I really promote and do in all my projects now, is this notion of foraging ideas, farming knowledge, and fermenting cultures. So I actually do workshops on that as well. But essentially, what we look at in terms of building narratives is augmentation rather than anthropomorphism. So augmenting and amplifying non-human qualities and values to them, rather than projecting human traits of them and trying to assimilate them into anthropomorphic paradigms. And what I think this does is it kind of creates a value over validation. Yeah, and just to finish, these are some of the different interventions I've done with foraging, farming, and fermenting, and kind of making art out of these experiential processes. So yeah, New Directions is kind of combining this with neural networks and machine learning to kind of look at intelligent non-human systems with AI, essentially. Yeah, and I'll end it there. Thanks for listening. I'm sorry, everyone, if I went a bit over time. Yeah, thanks for listening.
No, that's very cool. So much interesting stuff there. I get it that it's hard to pack it all in. Again, amazing. And if there's any questions, please load them in the chat. I'm particularly thinking of you, Dicult350, who are apparently on the line. Think about questions to put in the chat. Um, in the meantime, let's move on to Jason Nelson.
Hey kids. I'm Jason. First, very impressed by Jordan and Julian's work. I love how this field and the kind of things we're talking about materializes in a range of different projects that are coming out. And yeah, I think it's super impressive. Alinta, I'm going to spotlight myself. There we go. Hi. This, by the way, is a real background. That's a real projection happening. Someone was asking me about that before. That is a real thing. So I'm just going to show a few works here. And as I'm doing that, I just kind of want to tell you a story. Now, honestly, a lot of what I've learned about this kind of field and working with more than human or non-human animals comes from our host for this event, Alinta Krauth. She's really the one who's inspired me to even explore this. And indeed, I fondly recall times at which in Queensland, where we lived kind of out in the hinterland of the Gold Coast, when it would rain, we would always go out to the road, the nearby narrow road, and we would pick the frogs and the turtles off the road because they would come there after it would rain, and we would do that to keep them from being smushed by cars and stuff. And it was always this kind of strange moment where it always felt like to me that, there was this sense of like these creatures deserve value, these creatures deserve an existence, and to just sort of ignore them and to view them as something in the road that's in your way, I always find quite horrible. And so we would spend a lot of time doing that. Now that directly relates to the first project I'll show you. So I'll share my screen and share the audio. Let's do the whole thing. There we go. So I made this very recently. This is a project called Diver Quilt Magnet. No one's really seen this project before, so you'll be among the first in the world to actually see it. It's kind of a simple digital narrative work. What it does is you open it, and it creates a creature. Now, these creatures are entirely generated, and each time you open it, an entirely new creature is created. Now, the hook here, or how this relates, is this. These creatures only exist once. They do not exist again. So if you want to create a new monster, which I am sure you absolutely do, then you will have to kill this monster. You'll have to destroy it. And it will not, seriously, ever exist again. The total combinations of the monsters in this project are close to 1 billion. So I guess technically, if you click this 1 billion times, you might get the same monster twice. You click it, you get a death certificate. This is you killing this monster. You're intentionally getting rid of it. On the right, you get a list of extinct monsters that you've actually destroyed. Now we have a new monster. This is Whip-tailed Doorman, Tram, and Spectre. And it has a little story to it. And it's a generative monster that's created from bits and pieces and parts. And to me, this equates to both this idea that I think we live in this kind of world where we think that these creatures around us are quite disposable, and yet if you imagine the kind of systems and the kind of time and the kind of development that went into making them, it's tragic that we just think of them as something that we need to get rid of or they're in our way. And so I want to make a project that kind of explored this, that enabled this kind of experience of continuously ending creatures just to see a new one. This one's Feral Registered Driver. Behind a laundromat vent under a desk lamp with a dented shade, it dragged scorpion tail over sooty bricks, lifted a roll of tape to its little mini mouths and dropped it again, left a wet boot print stayed in one corner. And let's kill it. Diver Copper Runic Tattoos Muffle. In the boiler room under a sodium streetlight, it dragged keychain tail over rusted grating, lifted a roll of tape to its speaker grill and dropped it again, dropped gray ash stayed in one corner. And so for this, to me, I've made, as Alinta knows, I've made a lot of these kind of generators. And in part, I guess it's also playing off of this kind of contemporary experience of constantly scrolling, constantly getting through new content. But honestly, I think that kind of relates to maybe a society or a world in which we kind of throw these other creatures away, that we don't necessarily see them as a value, we see them as just something that's around us. Related to that is a project that Alinta and I both created, and apologies if you were going to talk about this at some point in the future, Alinta. Good, I'm glad. This is called Impossible Creatures, also called Creo Creatures. We've done a couple different iterations of these. We did it for a festival in Australia, and we also did it for the Science Museum at Michigan State University. And the idea of the project is we wanted to sort of create augmented reality work and AR work that would allow you to engage with future creatures. Now, these are obviously science fiction. They're quite extreme. They're satirical, kind of like some of Julian's work. We engage a lot with humor. And so the point of this was to sort of create a series of different creatures that are quite absurd. This is the kind of things that creatures would have to do to evolve, let's say thousands of years from now, to survive in a more contemporary world. And so if we click on that, you can see some of them. And so this is butter squid, for example. Due to rises in ocean salinity, butter squid evolves wings. To avoid dangerous waters, they migrate along the trade winds. When they enter safer areas, they lose their wings and return to the ocean. And you can flip it over, and you get advantages and disadvantages to these things. And so we created a lot of these things that actually, if you saw them in context, we tried to create them for very specific locations in Brisbane. So you might have a place near a river, you might have a place near certain skyscrapers or construction zones or these kinds of things. And so we created these sort of mobile first creatures that people could experience. And all of them are interactive, and there's lots of Easter eggs and kind of cool things that we typically have in these kind of projects. This is also something I made very recently, and it kind of reminds me, if you look at Julian's front page, you've got one of your websites, Julian, you've got a swarming effect of birds that are moving. And I love that kind of, there's a certain code set you can explore in terms of swarming activity. And I find it quite beautiful and sort of interesting. And Alinta and I have done projects in Brisbane, a big projection project we did there recently called Cottage Year, where one of the sections for one of the days projects birds onto this giant building in downtown Brisbane that have that kind of swarming effect. And this sort of explores that as well. So this is a little story, and you swarm the ants, and then the ants come in and they grab bits of the words, and then they take them away, and they store them somewhere else, and then the ants go back into the ground. And then, of course, humans don't like that. We don't like the way the ants are doing that. So we instead get our little robots. And then the robots come in and they grab the words and redeposit them into the writing in kind of strange locations. And so you're constantly recombining the work through this kind of interaction and this strange sort of conflict between the swarming ants and the swarming robots. And at the end of it, you get a very different experience, and you get a very different bit of writing. And it does actually use an algorithm that actually is a swarming algorithm, so they do not go to the same place every time. And how they're choosing different locations is kind of based on the actions of other ants, as well as the actions of the robots themselves. It's simple. It's sort of exploring concrete poetry and digital poetry, but I really kind of love this one, actually. And they make little sounds, and they're just cute. They're just really cute. Let's kill that. So another project I've done, and I feel like, we've kind of done, I think Jordan and Julian and I have all done a lot of different projects. And I think that's a really, as I said before, it's a really good testament to this field in the sense that, we're looking at this from different angles. And so there's no one way of doing it. There's no one way of centering a non-human animal or more than human creature. I think you can do a variety of things. Linda, oh, there you got it. Okay. This is a project called Edge Species. Now, I made this in a way, this one, whereas the others are kind of humorous, this is much darker. If you don't know what an edge species is, an edge species is a species that is on the edge in terms of possibly extinction, or at least being critically endangered. And there are, this is a very small selection of all the species that meet in this category. And so I wanted to create a work that sort of explored this in this 3D environment. And if you've caught on to this, very much this looks kind of like a graveyard, and that's intentional. It is generative, so each time you explore it, you'll kind of recombine them in different ways. And then the names of the creatures are on the top. They briefly appear and then get pulled down into what is the grave of the work. It's a fully sort of 3D experience that you can explore. And then these ones that are darkened out, the ones that have no words on them, those are species that have gone over from being edge species to actually just being gone. Like they just no longer exist. One of the things that inspired this work was an experience I had here in Bergen. So shortly after Linda and I arrived here in Bergen from Australia, we went to the Natural History Museum. And there on the top floor of the Natural History Museum is the carcass, for a lack of a better word, the stuffed carcass of a thylacine, or a Tasmanian tiger. And honestly, I cried at seeing that. And the reason for that, it was just such a strange experience to come from Australia, to understand that there's kind of mythos around a Tasmanian tiger, a thylacine, and how it's gone, it's lost. And it has quite a strong resonance in Australia. And then somehow we've moved all the way across the world to Bergen, which, it's a beautiful city, but it's also small. It's only about 300,000 people. And there in the Natural History Museum, they have the remains of a thylacine. And I just think how strange that was. How we've lost this beautiful creature, and yet it sort of strangely continues in a museum in a place all the way across the world, kind of hidden in a corner, surrounded by other sort of stuffed creatures. Now, of course, this has nothing to do with the museum. It's a wonderful place, and they do great work. This is something that happened a long time ago. But it just it just had a serious amount of resonance. And it made me start thinking about all these other creatures that have evolved and been created over, a massive amount of time, that are now just going away. And so this work in many ways kind of explores this concept, in creating a very small and sort of limited engagement with that. Overall, and I won't take a whole much more time, overall, a lot of my work, and again, Alinta and I collaborate quite heavily, so a lot of Alinta's work engages with these kind of creatures. And thinking of this will stretch into the next conversation. One of the things I love about seeing Julian and Jordan's work is it gives you more inspiration, gives you more ideas. And I love the way their work, Jordan's work, for example, engages more with gaming worlds and has a real poetic resonance, which I find very impactful. And I love how Julian's work engages with the physical world, and engages with science very heavily. And I find that really powerful. Well, and frankly, I'm just jealous of their works. And so I'm quite happy to be here to contribute a little bit. So I'll leave it there. And Alinta, I don't know if you have questions or whatnot.
Thank you so much, Jason. Yeah, wow. Three amazing and very sort of quite different creative practices between the three of you there as well. Yes, let's move just shortly into question time before we move on to the creative play area. We do have a question in the chat from Alec. I hope I'm saying that correctly. And the question is for you, Jason. The question is, did you consider trying to label the monsters in Diver Quilt Magnet as some other type of creature other than a monster to see if it would affect or change the way that people interact with or feel towards those creatures? So would they be more compassionate, for instance, if you said they were animals or said they were robots or said that they were monsters?
Yeah. Okay. I will respond to that. In fact, I'm going to respond to that with a thing here. I'm going to type in my address here. And Alec, there it is. That's my email address. And if Alec wants to email me, I will give Alec credit because I'm going to actually make a future iteration of that work with that idea in mind. You'll notice another comment above there. Our good friend and highly noted and award-winning digital creator, Vigard Fotland, has also noted another project called Dogs and Logs. I will briefly say, I'm not going to show you the project, but I'll briefly say that when Alinta and I were in Regensburg, Germany, recently visiting Ostradinseln, we went to the Dachshund Museum. A Dachshund is a sausage dog. And there's a whole museum devoted to the sausage dog. There's a lovely couple, a couple guys who run it, and they're amazing. And they run this very specific museum devoted just to sausage dogs. And so we both have started making works for them. And one of them was a generator work called Dogs and Logs that generates dogs. And then I didn't think that was enough, so I added logs because dogs and logs. But yeah, Alec, I love this idea, and if you don't mind sending me an email, then I will actually make a version of that project that does what you say, because I think that's a good point, and it would actually do that. I think my kind of strange robots are kind of interesting and fun, but I do think it's lacking a little bit, and this idea of making monster or creature generators is something I'm very interested in right now, and so I will definitely do that. So thank you for that.
Cool. We also have a question from Mick with Berland. This is for all of the speakers. As seen in your many fantastic artworks, we can fruitfully explore more than human agency by setting up generative situations through running digital programs or by supporting a microbiome, which introduce more than human agency through randomization. However, I'm interested in hearing a bit more about how more than human agency influences your process of ideation or conceptualization before reaching the point of creating the generative environment. So does everyone want to speak a little bit about their influences and how that kind of happens early on in the process?
Jordan?
Yeah, I can go first. I was just turning my mic off. Yes, as I kind of said really, really briefly at my presentation, mine is really pragmatic and kind of serendipitous experiences and encounters. So the Grundle, for example, this was quite an interesting project because I got stuck in Austria during COVID. I couldn't go back to Perth. I couldn't go to London because I had no reason to move to the UK again. But anyway, so I was I was living in a co-op farm and it was crazy. And then I moved to a boat because that was less crazy. And these fish are everywhere there. And so we were kind of fishing them. And it was through these kind of emergent narratives of people, how they evolved, the fact that they follow this pathway that at the time kind of refugees from places like Syria and that were following the same path into Northern Europe. And from that, it kind of became a questioning of what is this organism? How will we have a relationship with it? And also, how can we kind of use augmenting it as a method of questioning kind of things such as our own perspectives? And that's the same with the Pearl Muscle project, where I was doing the residency in Buffalo, and everyone hates these zebra mussels. So it was like, well, why don't we make them valuable? So it's kind of looking at something, understanding what it is, our relationships with it, and then kind of trying to find a speculation of that, I guess. So that's kind of my way of working. And the microbes was the same thing, because during COVID, everyone I was living with got really, really into fermentation, which of course is probably the main microbial collaborative task that we do these days. So yeah, that's kind of how I work, I guess. Augmenting the relationships.
Hey, Jordan, I might go next and then you. That's all right? Cool. I'm actually again, because Alinta and I collaborate a lot, I'm actually going to mention something that we had kind of discussed that kind of relates to this. So, I mean, in some ways, it's kind of an interesting process in the sense that you're making works for humans, at least I have been lately making works for humans on screens that somehow relates to non-human animals, but perhaps doesn't really give them any agency, right? And maybe even doesn't directly connect to them. And I know Linda will be talking about some for other projects later on in this series, so I won't talk about those. But I will talk about some conversations that we had that I thought would be really interesting and something I'd like to explore more. So, for example, imagine you did a work that was just scent and it wasn't designed for humans at all. It was just designed for dogs, for example, or other creatures. And it was a thing where you just had scent. And this was an artwork that you were designing for other people's experiences. The problem with doing that, of course, is that how do you know? Like we're still anthropomorphizing it. We're still guesstimating on how a dog or another creature might respond to a scent. Indeed, we might be disrupting the environment. We might be causing harm in some kind of way. And so it can be really difficult. I think as a poet, I kind of back up on this idea of my own sort of personal experiences. I talk to crows. I know that seems silly, but I often do as I'm walking around. Like, hey, crow, how are you? And this kind of thing I think is an interesting moment in the sense that then you start imagining, or at least you start centering the creatures around you. And then I think that starts to filter into your work when you start sort of thinking about that and you start centering them, even in your sort of daily experience, even if that centering doesn't really involve much engagement from them. I mean, the crow does not care that I'm saying hello to it. Indeed, probably sees me as a danger. Well, definitely probably sees me as a danger. I mean, look at me. I look dangerous. But it's yeah, so I mean that's kind of my approach, but it is a tricky area because it's like this idea of agency, and like we also worked on a project involving a dog, and our dog we had Loki, and thinking about how's the dog be involved in a collaborative game, for example. And that was kind of interesting in the sense that do you direct the dog? The dog's domestic. We kind of own the dog, whatever that means. So it's tricky territory, but for me, it's more about just trying to center as much as I can the other creatures around me. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, no, thanks for the question and also for the other answers. Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't know that I have a huge amount to add actually from what Jason said. I think Jason, you kind of hit on a lot of the similar things that I might say in response to this. But I think, yeah, I mean, I think this whole, right, the whole topic of more than human or non-human narratives, of course, and perspectives and agency, I think is is of course such a fascinating and important topic, and then also such a tricky or complex topic, obviously from the standpoint of all of us being human here and on this call, and like that whole question of how what does it mean to try to understand or perceive or interact with non-human agency, etc. I think, again, for me, my process, like with Jason, I mean, kind of goes back to a lot of it. It's like for me, I'm not setting out to sort of simulate usually like a particular mode of non-human or animal agency or something like that. And I'm not looking to sort of create sort of like a scientific simulation or projection in some way, but it's this kind of like rooted again in that kind of idea of poetic attention, I guess. Paying attention, looking. I mean, I think the thing that to me that really resonates to me with just sort of poetic process, right, is always this kind of falling back over and over again, right, on just sort of like trying to open your eyes, trying to look at the world closely, trying to pay attention to the things that, like Jason talked about, these things that maybe we that are all around us that we don't normally see, that we don't normally pay attention to, right? And I think the poets are kind of constantly calling us back to try to look at, right, and really look at the things around us, really see them, really. And then I think like the poetic imagination, right, of trying to begin to again trying to starting from the standpoint of, again, a slightly different process than say from the scientific angle, right? But this process of trying to imagine, right, that what this experience might be like, that maybe there's a subject here, right? What are they saying? What does agency look like to them? What does the world look like to them? So all very theoretical. I mean, for me, like on a practical way, right? Again, it's like much like Jason said, but it's like taking my kids to school every day and walking past the ducks that are here, in the process of having recently made it on the Itchen River that's flowing through Winchester, and just like what that daily sort of process of walking by them, and again, it's like sometimes I'm careful to pay attention or just to see them or to see other things, and I'm looking at other times I'm distracted. My mind's on completely other stuff. I'm just walking by. I don't see them at all. But that process of over time, again, just trying to see, to pay attention, and to try to, on the one hand, imagine, and to try to, on the other hand, observe. What does, again, it's like I think it's like there's a lot of the question of what agency is for those ducks in their life and how they're living, is, again, I think there's a lot of ways in which I can't connect directly to what that means, right? But I can start to perceive them, again, like in the Ursula Le Guin's quote, right? Start to think of them as subjects rather than objects, right? As kind of a starting point, which is to me kind of that entryway in. Yeah.
I have a few questions, but maybe I shouldn't ask all of them. But just to ask one quick question. This is one for Julian, actually. One of the projects that you mentioned was about an invasive species, the goby. Um, and I was interested to know what sort of discussions happened around that tension of moral value, because you have to sort of separate the idea of this is a creature with a life that has a value, but then they're doing damage. And why are they doing that damage, and who put them there? Was this something that you had to work through? Was this kind of moral gray area?
To some extent, but what was kind of interesting with both the zebra mussel and the goby was because obviously, like growing up in Australia, we kind of conditioned to be like, oh, every species that's new ruins the environment. And those two examples I talked a lot with a couple of ecologists about, because in some cases, of course, they're not invasive species, they're colonizers, and they're actually better for the environment. And this happens, a lot as well. And so with the goby, for example, there was absolutely no negative impact on native species from this in the Danube. In fact, it actually increased biodiversity and helped other species because there was less pressure on fish eating native species because they don't have a swim bladder, so they sit on the bottom and they're very slow. So they're easy to catch. And then it's the same with the Lake Erie zebra mussels, where there's this whole, like, if you want to be a conservationist, you say, oh, they've come over from ships from Russia and blah, which creates this whole weird narrative, which has nothing to do with the fact that they're there. But not only have they've over-colonized, so they are invasive, yeah. But the fact that there's millions of them in Lake Erie means that this post-industrial brown waste site, which is all of upstate New York, has now become swimmable again, by no means by human intervention. It's 100% these filter mollusks that have created that situation. For me, that's valuable. Why, and anyway, if you think about this in terms of ethics and humans, we can then translate that into this big discussion we have at the moment in the UK about migrants and the value of migrants, and particularly labor, because all these, pardon my French, but all these shitty jobs migrants tend to do, and then they're not appreciated for them. So, like, literally cleaning jobs, and that's what these zebra mussels are doing. So by making it make a pearl, the idea is you're kind of subverting those kind of value decisions. But then, to quickly finish by answering your point, maybe there is an ethical thing, because you're then colonizing those species to use for your discourse that you're creating around this. And the morals and the ethics of that, it's kind of like, this idea of doing environmental projects and then flying across the world to talk about them. Like, is the damage you're doing by flying there to talk about it offset by the actual project you're doing? And I would argue, if you're making an artwork, probably not, right? So there's all these moral questions that are inherent within it. But again, I think by celebrating the organisms, you somehow subvert those ideas. And so ethically, I don't have a problem with it. The opposite, I guess.
Cool. Thank you all so much. I think we're going to move into creative playtime session now. This is meant to be just an improvised conversation at the end here, essentially a chat between our three participants about their practices and how ideas emerge, and see what they come up with on the spot. At this point, I'm going to hand over some of the hosting activities to Jason, who's going to kind of lead the creative play session a little bit. Jason, how would you like to proceed with this?
Well, it's interesting. I feel like we've already started getting into this territory and talking about how we kind of do these things. This is very much, I mean, like a lot of things we do, as you've seen for all of us, this was kind of an experiment we thought we would try in this kind of laser talk, where maybe we would discuss this kind of process aspect of what we do in this kind of live way. And now that I'm thinking about it, maybe instead I'll just ask some questions and we can kind of just start it very organically. So maybe, how about this? Because initially we were thinking about this notion of, if you have a creative process, right, and you're making a work, and kind of like the question asked before from Mick about, thinking about the non-human animal agency and thinking about centering other creatures, and then relating that to process and how we do that. So maybe to start with, if we're sort of imagining making a project, I guess I'll start with Jordan and Julian, and maybe just ask you simply if, maybe we'll start actually with the collaboration between artists and scientists, because in a way, a lot of what we're doing kind of explores that in some kind of way. So maybe to start with, let's think about if you could do anything, like if you could make a project and you kind of had not unlimited funds, but you had some funds and you had the stuff available, what kind of project would we make? What kind of creatures might we engage with or not? What kind of scientists might we engage with or not? What kind of environments might we engage with or not? Any thoughts on that? Or even just broadly, your experience about working with scientists or with science. And the reason why I say science and scientists as a starting point is just because I think that that filters into a lot of the work that we're doing, which is that, you want to kind of maybe think about animal behavior, or you want to think about ecosystems. And again, Julian, your work's an amazing example of that, about how you are sort of engaging with the science of what this is. And I think, Jordan, you do that as well, but maybe in a very different way. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think maybe I'll let Julian go in here for first, just because I think, yeah, Julian's work obviously has that kind of strong intersection in a different way than mine does. For me, I think it's often, again, it's like this approach of this interest in sort of, and again, why I sort of mentioned like the workshops among other things when I was talking is because this sort of interest in sort of all these things, kind of getting back to what you were talking about, Jason, with the, I think with the Little Monsters project, about this idea of the things that we sort of cast off or take for granted or don't notice around us, and this idea of can I start to pay attention um, to the things around me, and to the non-human subjects around me, right? And then going beyond that, right, sort of, can we all start to do that? And in a way, it's a very, right, it's like my practice in that sense, right, it is this very sort of, kind of small, it's like this question of like, oh, if you could do anything or with any scale, right? Like for me, it is this interest in a way, in particular, this interest in the small, in the tiny, in the things that go unnoticed, in the kind of cracks, and in something that, the blade of grass that's growing in the cracks and whatnot. So in a way, it is a very small thing. And again, it's like, because I'm oftentimes usually not working. It's more about the imaginative and the imaginary, more than say like creating a simulation of an ecology or something like that. So it's, I think, a little bit this interesting adjacent thing. But that's where I think, yeah, I'll let Julian speak directly to that kind of, obviously, with that sort of collaboration with the scientific world and scientific perspectives.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, yeah, so obviously I've worked quite interdisciplinary my whole career, basically. I mean, it is interesting because I've kind of, either through an inherent sense of discovery, or I'm easily bored, one of the two. I have gone on from so kind of doing marine biology, then doing fine arts, sculpture, then kind of going to digital media, etc. I have kind of done some of those things, but I wrote about this in my PhD as well. Kind of how we go about these collaborations, and I think one big thing is iteration. Another thing is ground up hierarchies of building. So because it's that's a negotiation that I actually should move on to, but yeah, I mean, we're working across them. Like for me, essentially, I wouldn't be able to do a lot of the things that I do without collaborating, but then also doing it in this kind of ground up method. I mean, it's a bit jarring sometimes for scientists, because they kind of like, this is my information, this is how I work. Whereas we kind of like, well, let's start from the beginning and let's do something, so we're creating rather than discovering, perhaps. But within that, I mean, it is, a lot of it is actually about people skills, I think, and it's kind of building a dialogue with a person. So that, I mean, this is me, and I'm reading this book at the moment about friendship as one of the strongest ways of building social and collaborative resilience. And so there is that aspect, and understanding that we all have expertise. And obviously, I mean, for me, I've had a lot of problems with computer scientists and also biologists, where they feel like their research is much higher than the level of the way that we're participating with their field. That's a challenge that I've encountered quite a lot. But yeah, I mean, it's different. It's different every time. But for me, a lot of it is about building a durational, longer thing. So we talked about this the other day. Not thinking it's a project that starts and ends in a period of time, but it continues. And to be honest, getting back to the economics of this whole thing, if you think about it, how do most collaborations end? It's when your funding ends, right? We could all continue collaborations through different iterations forever if we had the money to do it, and if you look at, these kind of more fine artists like Jeff Koons, who has massive warehouses of everyone making his art for him. Not that that's what we aspire to, but there's ways with money to kind of continue your work.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, if I had all the money in the world, I probably would just buy heaps of farms, and forests and not let corporations buy them, I wouldn't be making art. So yeah.
Okay. So maybe how about this as a starting point? I love how one of the things that seems like a common thread, which is this idea of paying attention to the creatures and the world around us and drawing, I guess, human attention towards that, right? So let's say we were to make a work, and let's say that was the goal, is we wanted to sort of do that. First, where would we do it? Would we do it on a farm? Would we do it in a city? Would we do it in the forest? Would we do it on people's phones? Would we do it in a physical way? So if we're making a project, so let's say the goal is we want people to pay attention to the creatures around them. Um, because, often they ignore them. Like in Norway, for example, Norway's a beautiful place. But I do find when I'm hiking around, Alinta and I go off and we go off trail and we're looking at creatures and we're looking at the moss and we're super fascinated by everything that's in the forest. And often we just see people zooming up the forest and come right back down, and it's an exercise thing. And of course, not everyone is that way. But how do we do that? So, any ideas for how we would maybe make a project? So, let's start with the idea of where it is. So, where might this project exist if we were to do it? And both physically, but maybe even virtually. Like, if it's a game, what's the setting? If it's a physical work in a physical world, what is it? Where is it set? Any thoughts on that?
I'll jump in really quickly because I've
Yeah.
always, being this kind of, I'm not going to say pioneer, but, working with augmented reality since 2005, I've always merged physical with virtual. So with a work like this, for example, I would kind of suggest we use a hybrid approach where you have kind of site-specific things, but obviously not everyone can go to that space, like we talked about travel. So yeah, I think merging the spaces with a kind of a network of digital infrastructures, so to speak.
Mm. And would there be something for maybe like a person's phone, or are we thinking about something embedded in the space?
Well, I think both. I mean, I always kind of think of this like if you think of web presence, we always used to talk about this in the early days of it. Like you have your central node, and then you have your peripheral nodes. I
Mm.
like the actual site to be the central node because again, if we think of that in terms of narrative, it physically situates that in place.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's also things like experiencing these things, and sorry, Jordan should jump in as well. Experiencing, like you said, things on the go is very different to in a gallery, so to say, and getting people out of galleries is one way to kind of build empathy for natural systems, I find.
Mm.
But
Yeah, I totally agree. Jordan?
Yeah. No, I mean, I like the combination of, the idea of, I think the placement, again, to me, it's like I often usually with my work, right, I'm thinking about sort of the placement and specificity is really significant, right? Because it's like not sort of about things generally usually, right? It's about noticing something particular, about seeing something particular, as you gave, I mean, so that, you take this example of like noticing the moss on the way up the mountain or whatnot, right? So I think that idea of placement is interesting and significant, right? I mean, like, these two interconnected things that we're talking about, right? Like on the one hand, the question of what are we talking about? Where are we talking about? What's the specific thing, right? What is this path in Norway and this, and where is it? And what, what's the experience there, right? And having something. So I think, I mean, the cool, so I think there's really something very interesting and site specific artwork in that sense, right? Something that's made, say, for the people experiencing that moment in that place, right? But then I think there's something very cool also about sharing specificity, sharing this realization or this moment or this place and what's going on in this place or what we should notice in this place with people, yeah, who again aren't necessarily there, right? I think that question of, right, again, I think that's the thing, like with my own thinking, right, going back to like the poetic and whatnot, right, is like a lot of the power of poetry, I think, is again this relationship between the sort of the specific and the universal or the specific and the shared, right? And it's like I think a lot of the power oftentimes is that, right, it's like it's seeing this work about this mountainside in Norway and the things you might notice on this trail, right, may well remind someone of something they may notice in a totally different context. right? But that's part of that. But then on the same time, right, it's like it's the specificity of the work of this particular work, say that we're making about this trail in Norway, right? That makes it that actually would make it powerful or striking or memorable, right? Like someone's not going to write again. It's like the whole reason to write a poem or make an artwork of any kind of thing, right? It's like if you just say the idea of like, okay, here's an idea of like pay attention to the moss when you're walking, right? It's not very striking, not very memorable, right? But I think that the more you place and pay attention to that specific path that you're talking about, right? The specific mountainside, the specific path, the specific piece of moss, right? The more it allows that work to be memorable and interesting and hopefully connect to people. Again, it's like even who have never seen that trail, who don't live in Norway and everything else, right? But it's like you can still take away these connections. So this is all to say, just kind of bouncing around between what both of you have said, but this interest in like, I guess, right? I think it's really cool if you can do something that's both very specifically about a place,
Yeah.
something that potentially is an art, place-specific installation, right, of some kind or something for the people there, but then also being able to open it up and share sort of what you've observed or what you're paying attention to say people who can't get there. I think both of those, being able to kind of cross that domain is really cool. So that's what I would, in this, for this work, that's what I would. That's what I would propose. Yes, let's do something specific on the trail, and let's have something that people can interact with, say, online or in another way, to to notice these things as
Yeah.
well.
Maybe one way, so I'm just gonna, I mean, we're not gonna obviously create a thing right now, but I love this bouncing around of ideas. And so I'm just gonna mention a few things, but maybe one way we're sort of thinking about this, because I agree with you, like one of the challenges of the locative work, for example, is this idea of traveling and getting there and who is it for, and often I've struggled with that because you make a work for a very specific location and that has a lot of impact on those people in that location, but then there's the rest of the world. So maybe in a way, we're talking about a system, something you're developing that would allow people to sort of create a work that would engage with the world around them and be specific, but it would be a system that lets them sort of do that, for example. And then maybe somehow in the system, it is kind of centering the creatures around them. I'm not sure exactly how it would do that. I guess you could explore things like object recognition, for example. Maybe you have to identify a tree, maybe you have to identify something as a starting point. Um, I do think about how I'm sure this exists elsewhere, but I'm always charmed by the fact that as you're walking around in Bergen, they have these little wooden stakes that people put in the ground, and I think it's connected to like a little mapping app or something that allows you to sort of use your a little QR code or whatever, and you kind of scan that little wooden stake, and then it records kind of where you are. And I think it's a sort of a gamified version of that, for example.
Mhm.
And just a side story, one of Alinta's beautiful works that she's made was that work you did in bioluminescent walking in Mount Tamborine in Australia. And as we were setting it up, it was raining, or it started to rain, because of course it was in a rainforest, right? So you'd expect a little bit of rain. And so we quickly went down to a takeaway shop and we found little aluminum takeaway containers and we use those on top of the projectors to sort of keep them dry. And I thought that was a really kind of interesting engagement of thinking about putting something in the wild and then having it, dealing with the environmental impact of that or dealing with just the realities of the kind of space. Another question about this that relates to all this and thinking about making work is where do you think this line is between advocacy and sort of creativity or artwork or poetry, right? Because a lot of work that talks about animals, I feel like some of it does have a sort of advocacy element to it, of like we're trying to draw attention to an issue. Um, and yet, where is that line? Is that something that's important to have, or is it enough to have just simply, this is a story? We're trying to sort of tell the story of this forest or someone's experience in a specific location. Um, where do you see that situated? Because I always struggle with myself, right? Some of my works you've seen are humorous and kind of whimsical, and other works are trying to make a very sort of specific
Mm.
maybe not a political point, but trying to advocate for change of some kind. So in your creative process, if we were to make a work like this, is there a line there? Do we bother with that? Is that something that we feel like is would be important in the creation of this kind of work?
I think, I mean, for me, this is making me think of Alinta's question about ethics and morality, because it's funny, like the two projects we talked about, positioning kind of these non-human aspects as tools, right? Like fermenting a fish, it's not collaborating with you, you're killing it and fermenting it. So that probably goes over the step of advocacy, because you're advocating. In Australia, they do this with this new kind of invasive species cuisine kind of thing. And yeah, that's very different to what we're talking about, because that's not a way of empathy building. It's not a way of creating a discovery, so to say, in the way that we intend. So I think, yeah, I think about how you go about interfacing the public with a work like this. And that's really where the creative discourse comes in, right? Whether it's through game spaces, mobile spaces, physical kind of interventions. Um, yeah, I think it's in how the narrative is constructed, or to put it in the way Jordan's kind of speaking, that what are the poetics of this kind of yeah.
Mm.
Sorry, I'm just typing in some
Yeah.
words here. I just find it interesting as we're talking about this and making it work. A couple of things have come up, sort of notion of centering. That should be a comma between centering and empathy, but I guess you could also say centering empathy. Centering, empathy, attention, location. I find that interesting. Jordan, what were you thinking?
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, well, can you say the question again, and just in terms of, I mean, I know we were talking about advocacy, like what, okay, can you kind of reframe, say again, like
Well,
sort of what they,
it's just this sense of like when you're talking about I always find in my own work I kind of struggle sometimes between this notion of I want people to make a change. And so that's
mm,
like a goal of the work, right? A
mm,
goal is get people thinking about a thing, and then hopefully through the process of thinking about that thing or whatever it is, they will then make a change in their own interactions with the world. And then sometimes I just want to tell the story of, or I want to engage somehow with the natural world, and I just want people to sort of like we were saying, have empathy. And that's enough for me. I'm not thinking about what specific change might they make. And I just find this is an interesting thing that kind of swirls around this kind of work, right?
yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, yeah, and I think it's so, yeah, vital to have different people kind of focusing on different things all kind of through, it's like, I think, right, it's like there's a whole way you can kind of think about from sort of, I don't know, you what could, kind of from the ground level upwards in terms of like individuals up through collectives, organizations, societies, policies, et cetera. Um, right. And I think all of those things are in some way clearly connected. I mean, I think for me and my own work, yeah, it's like most of the time I'm hoping that individuals who encounter my work will come away and be thinking be thinking a little bit differently, right? Like again, it's like, yeah, see things a little bit differently, maybe considering who might be a subject a little bit differently, be paying attention to things around them a little bit differently, maybe seeing a mountain or a duck or whatever else a little bit differently. And I think, right, in my mind, again, it's like that. Yeah. So my work is less usually concerned about trying to say, um, yeah, push, say, for a particular policy that needs to happen or something like that. But I think in my mind, it's like these things definitely, are connected in the sense that it's like, I guess I'm sort of chiseling away, I guess I feel like at that maybe sort of like that most sort of kind of root level of just sort of like, hey, how do we see things in the world? Because if we don't see things or notice things or aren't able to pay attention, certainly we're not going to create, say, policies that protect things that we're not paying attention to or not seeing. Right. And then I think also for me, again, it's like that what has become more and more, in recent years, the strong interest in, I guess you could say, again, kind of, I mean, it's the same thing in a way, but maybe more explicit of just trying to, again, kind of pass on the idea of poetic thinking or poetic seeing in a sort of I guess like, trying to create little ripple effects, right? Again, in this idea of like encouraging other people to also make poems or make game poems about, right? It's like my kind of the kind of thing that I'm on right now is just sort of telling everyone I meet to like make game poems, right? Because it's like, hey, you can do it. It's super accessible. You can, what are you seeing in your life? What are the things you're paying attention to? Make a little thing about this. And again, that attempt to sort of that idea that that this, these kinds of small ripples of people paying attention, making things about paying attention, other people interacting with those things, right? And that you get maybe that ripple effect kind of again, kind of at that base level that hopefully trickles up and means something over time. But obviously it's like this is work at any scale, right? That takes just many, many, many people, all of us working at it some level or other, right? So but anyway, I think that's kind of how I think about it, I guess, with my work is just kind of like, yeah, the sort of the connection or the chains or the ladders of how these things kind of relate to each other.
Yeah.
Can I just jump in from that,
Yeah,
Jason?
go ahead.
Yeah, I think just carrying on from that, because one of the things I think with kind of art and advocacy in art, well, two things basically. One of them is, and this is a discussion I have a lot, is this kind of really fine balance between creative practice obfuscating issues rather than advocating to them. But then if you're too explicit of the issues, there's more issues, right? Because it becomes less creative, it becomes more diagrammatic. But also, I really like this quote from Matthew Fuller in this book, Bleak Joys, with Olga Gureneva, where basically the start of that book, he says, making art about climate change is really difficult because no one wants to spend their spare time going to an art exhibition and being depressed. And I think that there's a lot of obfuscation space in there. And when you think about games as well, particularly climate games, if you're making them meaningful, they're not really that fun. And I've asked game students this before, why don't you play serious games? Because they're not fun. And there is that kind of aspect of accessibility there, which gets onto really quickly my second point. For me, something like what we're talking about, like this trail, for example, I think adding aspects of getting a sense of co-creation and collaboration with these non-human entities is quite important, because a really good way to build empathy is collaboration, right? And then that kind of also increases value. So I think, yeah, if there's a way that we could kind of do that, and one approach obviously is using tech like the way humans are supposed to, which is using it as a kind of tool for us to make the world easier and better to live in. So, using technology as the device by which we collaborate and communicate potentially.
Brilliant. All right. I think I can see people are sort of going. I promised, and then Lindsay, you don't know I'm going to do this, but I promised I would actually tell. I promised myself I would tell the story because I want it officially on a record. I love how all of these, one of the things that's sort of coming out of these conversations, and especially thinking about empathy, is that, a lot of times when we talk about these kind of issues, we're inundated with data, right? It's about numbers. Oh, this is the temperature. These are the number of species that are going, and this data is really valuable, incredibly important, but it's hard for people to empathize with it. And so I'll just tell you a brief thing that happened that I want to make a project out of. And it's a very small and very specific experience that talks about the zones of interaction between non-human animals and humans. So near where we used to live in Queensland, there was a golf course that was weirdly owned by the military. It was within walking distance of where we lived. And no one really went to this golf course. It was just this place where basically for us was a dog park. And there were platypus that lived in the creek. It was like a little, not quite a billabong, but almost like a billabong that went next to the golf course. And we would take our dog Loki there all the time. And it was this kind of place where you could let the dog out and let it be free and run around. And it was really lovely. And there was one area of this golf course where there wasn't golfing happening. So we felt comfortable letting Loki walk around there and run around and stuff. And he's a dog, so he would, take a crap because he's walking around, feels like doing it. Well, he just does it. And around the same time that we were walking Loki in that area, he was the only dog, by the way, that went to this little area of this golf course. Um, around that same time, Ron Howard, the movie director, was filming the movie 13 Lives, which is about a group of soccer players who were trapped in a cave. You might remember that story. Infamously, somehow the guy who's one of the guys that used to run Tesla, I won't say his name out loud, um, somehow got involved in that. Anyway, but the point is that Ron Howard was directing a scene. So there's a scene that was filmed in that golf course because they were using it as a location of kids playing soccer. And we noticed shortly after that scene was filmed, there was a giant sign that went up there where they were very angry, the people at the golf course, because Ron Howard evidently had stepped in some dog shit. Um, and he was very upset at this. So we couldn't have our dog running around anymore. And so our dog has a claim to fame that Ron Howard stepped in his crap, which then changed the rules on what you could do in this dog park with the creatures that you're with. Um, and I find that, as we're talking about this, a lot of it's also about this notion of like zones of interaction, which is, this idea that we have all our crap that we're creating, right? Ron Howard needs to film his important movie, and your dog's natural inclinations to sort of, give nutrients to the soil in a place that no one's walking, well, that's a problem, right? Because it's this kind of strange zones of interaction. And so one of these days, and I know it's very specific, but Alinta, I would love to make a work that is just this, which is just Loki walking around and then Ron Howard having to step in Loki's poop. There you go. All right. We might go to last words because I know people are sort of slowly leaving because I think most people came for an hour. So if you have any last words to say, that'd be great, and then maybe we'll wrap up. Is that all right, Alinta?
Yeah, please. Any last words? And then I might do a quick summary for everybody.
Okay. My last words is thank you so much for everyone coming and those people that had to go. Um, and I find this super fascinating. And I do genuinely hope for Jordan, Julian, Alinta, and anyone else actually who's out there who's interested that we can actually collaborate and make something along these lines. I think it'd be super fun. Sorry, next.
Yeah, well, I think likewise for me. I mean, just yeah, no, thanks for everyone who came today. Thanks so much to Alinta and Jason for kind of organizing these. I mean, this was a lot of fun. I think very, yeah, I mean, really cool. I think certainly for me, hopefully interesting for other people too. But to see, again, it's like I think it's such an interesting sort of conversation to me about our different, the ways in which our different practices kind of connect and overlap in different ways and are quite different in other ways, right? And what kind of insights come out of conversation like this, for me at least, are very, very interesting. A lot to think about, and very fruitful. So yeah, no, thanks everyone for coming. Thanks for organizing this. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, same. It's been great. It's always one of those interesting things because quite often you see artifacts, but you don't discuss processes. And yeah, I mean, obviously we've talked about this a bit, but yeah, that understanding process of making makes so much more meaning from works. Yeah, and so it's been really great to kind of unpack that quite a lot. So it's been yeah, thanks, Elena and Jason. It's been a really cool format to do a talk like this. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I really love this sort of live ideation and how this kind of leads to bringing up concerns and worries about telling narratives on behalf of others, but also the storytelling itself that emerges and those anecdotes that people have about human, non-human interactions and how those anecdotes and those kind of actual moments of life can inspire the creation of something new. Usually this kind of takes place behind closed doors, right? In institutions or even in artists' own heads when we're coming up with our next project. So it's been nice to get a bit of a peek behind the curtain of how you kind of work and all those rhizomic tendrils and vines and ant holes and rabbit holes that go in and out when you're trying to come up with something new. I know this has sort of been a smashing in of that process that might otherwise take quite a bit longer, but it's nice to see something that's usually kind of sort of kept a little bit private. I just want to thank everyone for coming today. Thanks to our three great speakers, of course, for sharing their incredible works. and for sharing their insights today. And a quick plug before we go for the next talk in this series of Laser Bergen. Our next talk will take place on the 16th of March on theory-linguistics and digital art practices, joined by Rewa Wright and Ordak Scholar, two fantastic interdisciplinary artists from the other side of the planet. So I hope to see you there. Thank you all so much. And thanks to the three of you for kicking off the Laser Bergen series on such a great note. It's really been a lot of fun.